Welcome to a new episode of the Sustainability Channel. I'm Thomas Stanley and I'm your host. And in today's episode, we are going to focus on CO2 emissions in different ways. And let's start by having a look at an article from Wall Street Journal. And it's on global CO2 emissions hit record high in 2023, IEA says. Declines in Europe and the US were offset by increases in China and India. Global carbon dioxide emissions reached a record high last year as extreme droughts hampered hydroelectric production across large economies, leading to a substantial increase in fossil fuel use, according to the International Energy Agency. Energy-related CO2 emissions rose by 410 million metric tons, or 1.1% year-on-year, reaching 37.4 billion tons in 2023, the Paris-based organization said Friday in its latest report. The use of fossil fuels to replace hydropower accounted for over 40% of the increase. In India and China, heavy reliance on coal and higher electricity demand following the post-pandemic economic recovery pushed emissions significantly higher, offsetting reductions in other economies. Emissions rose more than 7% on year in India, where a weaker monsoon season drove hydropower output lower. In China, emissions from energy combustion rose by 5.2% to 12.6 billion tons, by far the largest on a global scale despite the country's leading position in the deployment of clean energy technology. The agency's report refers to emissions from all uses of fossil fuels for energy purposes and industrial processes. In advanced economies instead, emissions fell 4.5% to a 50-year low last year, supported by a stronger deployment of renewables and energy efficiency measures. According to the agency, electricity generation from renewable sources and nuclear power in those economies reached 50% of total generation. In the European Union, emissions from energy combustion fell by almost 9% in 2023, driven by a surge in renewables generation and drop in both coal and gas generation. Still, the deployment of clean energy sources remains overly concentrated in advanced economies and China, the IEA said, calling for greater international efforts to increase investment and deployment in emerging and developing economies. So, how can we solve this? One solution is carbon capture. And here's an explainer from the Ecobusiness website how the world's largest ocean decarbonisation plant will work. The plant, backed by Singapore's water agency PUB and US-based startup Aquatic, aims to remove 10 tons of carbon dioxide from the ocean each day. Last week, Singapore's national water agency PUB and US-based startup Aquatic announced that they would be building the world's largest ocean-based carbon removal plant following a successful pilot. The US $20 million plant, dubbed Aquatic 1, will be able to remove some 3,650 metric tons of carbon dioxide per year from seawater, or 10 metric tons a day. This is 100 times more than Aquatic's existing pilot plants in Los Angeles and Singapore, each of which have removed 100 kilograms of CO2 a day from the ocean since March 2023. Comparatively, Singapore as a country emitted more than 50 million metric tons of CO2 in 2021, more than 13,000 times what the plant aims to remove. Over the next 18 months, researchers and experts from Aquatic and Institute for Carbon Management at the University of California, Los Angeles, will set out to build a plant at PUB's research and development facility in Tuas, located in western Singapore. So how will the plant work? The plant uses a novel electrolytic process developed by scientists at UCLA's Institute for Carbon Management, several of whom are part of Aquatic. Using the company's oxygen-selective anodes, an electrical current is passed through seawater from PUB's desalination plants. A series of chemical reactions breaks the water into its carbon-negative hydrogen and oxygen constituents. At the same time, dissolved and atmospheric CO2 are combined with the calcium and magnesium in the seawater to form solid carbonates, mimicking the natural process of seashell formation. before the seawater is then pumped back into the ocean where it has the capacity to absorb more CO2. Its alkalinity is restored by dissolving alkaline rocks prior to discharge. And here's a flow chart of the process. So what happens to the solid carbonates? PUB and Aquatic are working with collaborators in Singapore to research possible application for the solid carbonates. These solid carbonates could potentially be used in the construction industry for land restoration, cement or concrete, for instance. And what happens to the hydrogen produced by the plant? Examples of its uses include hydrogen fuel cells, hydrogen turbines for heat and power, as well as hydrogen for storage and distribution. But there is a critical sentiment surrounding carbon capture, and we can have a look here at an article from Nature, and it's about the EU climate policy is dangerously reliant on untested carbon capture technology. Europe's ambition for emissions reductions is to be welcomed, but look at the detail and significant hazards emerge, they say. Last week, the European Commission published its long-awaited recommendations for climate targets for 2040. The Commission, which is the executive arm of the European Union, is recommending that EU member states cut greenhouse gas emissions by 90% by 2040, compared with 1990 levels. If countries agree, this would be an interim milestone ahead of the European climate law, which sets out a legally binding target for net zero emissions by 2050. A target cut of 90% is not as ambitious as some headlines suggest. The EU's existing policies could reduce emissions by 88% by 2040, according to its own projections. This would be achieved mainly through phasing out coal, converting most fossil fuel power to renewable sources such as solar, wind, and tidal energy, and electrifying transport. There will still be emissions from some vehicles on the road, from shipping, and from aviation. Some oil and gas power will also be in use. The Commission is, therefore, proposing to accelerate technologies such as carbon capture and storage, CCS, that can take up some of those remaining emissions and store the gases, possibly underground. The 2040 interim target was proposed by independent climate science advisors to the EU, and it's good to see their proposal being implemented. But the advisors also cautioned that getting to 90% by including CCS technologies will be challenging. The biggest obstacle is that the technology is not ready. At present, there is not a single fully operational CCS plant in Europe, nor a system for governing and regulating the technology. So far, 10 CCS projects are planned in the EU according to the Commission's science advisors. Assuming they all function, their combined carbon capture capacity is expected to be less than the expected contribution from CCS to achieve the EU's 2040 climate target. The interim climate target will now be discussed by member states and could face some opposition. European countries have historically set more ambitious climate targets than other high-income countries, but some of the bloc's largest nations, such as France and Germany, are now facing pressure to weaken climate commitments. This pressure is coming from many sides, including political parties and specific sectors such as farmers. People have legitimate fears about the loss of jobs in carbon-heavy industries and over who will pay the cost of converting to electrical vehicles and decarbonizing home heating systems. So we will continue following the development of new carbon capture technologies as well as CO2 emissions further on this channel. That's all for today. Over and out, and live a sustainable life.